Are cereal companies trying to kill us all? Join me for an expose on the dark side of grain and a history of cereal in the U.S. You unlock this door with the key of compassion. Beyond it is another world, a world of science, a world of common sense, a world of sanity. You're moving into a land of both empathy and ethics, of nutritional knowledge and empowerment. You've just crossed over to Dr. Osborne's Zone. Hey, welcome to Dr. Osborne's Zone. Tonight, we're going to be covering the history of grain predominantly in the U.S. So let's dive in. Going up to the board here, you can see in the year 1850, this was actually when processed flour became widely available. Now, when I say widely available, that's the key word here, because before this, there was a lot less grain available for the average household, at least to the quantities that we have today. Now, understand that in today's world, today's metric, 50% of total calories are from wheat alone. Now, this was not true in 1850, and so it's important to understand this perspective as we walk through the history tonight. So again, this new processing of flour allows for widespread use of grain. And so 5 years later, we get Dr. Guy starting to report descriptions of gluten intolerance and gluten sensitivity. So again, we introduce this processed flour. 5 years later, we get a doctor saying, hey, we're seeing signs of a problem here. So warning bells are going off. Now, fast forward, we go into 1892, and you have the shredded wheat machine invention. So William Henry Ford and Henry Drushel Perky invent a machine that shreds whole wheat, and they start producing shredded wheat in mass. So again, we have widely available processed grain, but now we have widely available processed packaged breakfast cereal. And this is when we really get breakfast cereal coming to the stage. Now, many of you grew up with the idea that breakfast cereal was, how do they put it? Part of a balanced diet, right? That's what we heard time and time again. Why part of a balanced diet? Because breakfast cereal is not a balanced diet. It's part of a balanced diet. And if you ever notice in those cereal commercials, they always had other food around the bowl of cereal. And this is the reason why is that it was very well known that breakfast cereal or cereals in general were very poor in nutrition. And so they had to use this terminology. They couldn't say breakfast cereal is a balanced diet. They had to say part of a balanced diet. And so we all grew up, we kind of subliminally put this part out of our mind, and what we really actually heard, this is the marketing genius behind some of these guys, is that we really just heard balanced diet. And so in our mind, what that did is it reinforced the necessity, in a sense, to actually eat grain in greater degrees. But again, we can thank the same man who revolutionized the car industry, Henry Ford, for creating the first shredded wheat machine that made cereal widely available. So that's 1892, and we fast forward a couple years. So again, fast forward to 1894, and then we have Dr. John Kellogg creating cornflakes. He did that with his brother, and so now we have the next cereal, making its way onto the scene, cornflakes. And then we have by 1897, and what's interesting about this is C.W. Post, who I believe was a patient of Dr. John Kellogg, and so he was so impressed by these cornflakes that it convinced him that he needed to get in on this and create grape nuts, which is ironic because grape nuts neither has grapes or nuts in it. It's a fully processed grain-based food that you have to soak or it'll rip a hole in the roof of your mouth. But again, invented in 1897 by C.W. Post. And so you'll recognize these two names, Post Cereal Company and Kellogg Cereal Company, both dominant forces in the processed cereal scene. And then 1922, after we've got shredded wheat, we've got cornflakes, and we've got grape nuts, we have another really smart doctor, Dr. Robert McCarrison, he starts warning his medical colleagues about the increase in intestinal diseases that he's seeing. So we have this kind of corollary now. And some of you will say, well, correlation is not causation. I don't disagree. But it's very interesting that he's making this correlation shortly after wide availability of processed cereals become kind of the standard. And then in 1931, another very brilliant doctor by the name of Dr. Willem Dickey, he starts experimenting with wheat-free diets in kids with celiac disease. And you have to remember, at the time, we didn't know what caused celiac disease. So he was very much a revolutionary pioneer, because he's the one who actually made the correlation and figured it out, that celiac was a manifestation of gluten. But he started out with wheat-free diets as part of that. Now, what's interesting about this gentleman, we'll talk about here in just a minute, because he made some great observations during World War II as well. And then we have, just a year later, in 1932, many of you have heard of Crohn's disease. It's an intestinal inflammatory disease, sometimes referred to as regional ileitis. But B.B. Crohn, Dr. B.B. Crohn, right, he identifies a new intestinal disorder. And we say new in quotation marks because it's new. This doesn't exist prior this time frame. So linked to grain consumption, now it's known as Crohn's disease, but originally it was called regional ileitis. So again, another disease of intestinal inflammation. So we've got several doctors here starting to put the pieces of the puzzle together. And then we get into the 1940s. And then we throw in a major curveball in the 1940s. What's that curveball? That curveball is chemical fertilizers. Now, I want to point out, and I want to back up for just a minute, this is before chemical fertilizers, right? So these guys are recognizing that processed cereal grain is causing intestinal inflammation and intestinal disease before the advent of all of these commercial fertilizers. Now, what was true of this time frame before those commercial chemicals is we had a couple of really smart guys. Haber-Bosch created nitrogen fixation, and this was really, they really started to stumble on this and really ramp it up in around the early 1900s, around 1908. And it was really through, I think, 1913, don't quote me on that date exactly, but so this is where nitrogen fertilizer, this is what gave us the ability to start producing high levels of fertilizer, because before this time, the world was running out of poop. And I mean that literally, like the world population was growing at such a fast pace that farming couldn't keep up with the food demand, and there wasn't enough poop. Remember, poop is what we use for fertilizer. And so there's this whole history behind collecting poop. Countries were collecting poop from everywhere they could. We ravaged all the bat poop and bird poop from South America for years. We were taking just big caches of collective poop, right? And we were shipping that all over the world to use as fertilizers because the stuff worked very well. So again, we were running out of the ability to keep up with the demand to feed the population. And these brilliant scientists, Haber and Bosch, created nitrogen fixation from air. And so this is how we came for nitrogen fertilizer. And so when this really began to hit the scene, and this is where chemistry really starts to take off, is now we have chemical fertilizers being added to increase crop yields and to grow things. But you got to remember that when you add these chemical fertilizers, you increase the yield. This is what this does, is increases the quantity of the grain that you can grow, but it also speeds things up. So it makes them bigger, and it increases quantity. So what you're ending up with is you're ending up with more product or more grain with less nutrients. So this is just one more problem. But even before this was happening, and again, I'm trying to be very clear with you, before this was happening, we were still seeing intestinal inflammatory diseases coming on the scene. So again, we've got farmers using chemical fertilizers, increasing yields, reducing nutrients in grain and other crops, and then, right after the Great Depression, which ended approximately in the late 1930s, early 1940s, government takes over and they start to set aside tax dollars, okay, to give to the farming industry to grow more corn, soy, wheat, and other seed-based, processed seed-based crops. And so we get this whole agribiz that comes out of government subsidies. And I say agribiz because the reason that what we are all told in some of the history books is the reason the government subsidized grain was to prevent farmers from going out of business. But the actuality is that the Great Depression had already put a lot of farmers out of business. And so this is where we had big companies coming in and buying out farms before the subsidies ever set in. So the subsidies actually benefited these big companies that bought the farmland from the bankrupt farmers as a result of the Great Depression. And so who were we really giving that money to? We were giving that money to these companies that were now growing with heavy chemical fertilizers, right? Reducing the nutritional quality of the food. And so, again, we were focusing all of the dollars on growing monocropping. And so this is really where monocropping began. Heavy, large swaths of land, acres and acres of land, thousands of acres of land were being used to grow predominantly just a handful of different types of crops. And again, this is in the early 40s. And then in 1943, we get this processed grain ban, which is a very interesting part of history. If you've ever picked up a loaf of bread or a box of cereal, you'll flip it over, you can see on the back it says fortified with, right? That terminology, fortified with. And then you'll see a list of different nutrients. And typically what you see are thiamine, niacin, you'll see iron and other nutrients, folate nowadays, or actually folic acid, which is synthetic folate. But what happened in 1943 is the U.S. government actually banned the sale of processed grains unless they were fortified with these nutrients, with these select vitamins and minerals. And so, and the reason why, what was the reason why? It was because, it was around 8,000 deaths every year were being caused by grain, by processed grain. And how so? They were causing diseases like beriberi, which is vitamin B1 deficiency, and pellagra, which is a niacin or vitamin B3 deficiency. And so people were dying, thousands of people were dying annually from the utilization of processed cereal and grain-based products. And so the government said, from now on, if you're going to sell it, you got to fortify it because of that. So what's interesting here is we have, again, cereal is taking off, and now it's killing people, and now the government says you have to fortify it. And so what happens next is the cereal industry says, okay, we're going to fortify it. And they do. They start fortifying. And instead of saying, hey, don't eat this cereal because it's really not a nutritious food and it's responsible for causing malnutrition and killing people, they were really brilliant at marketing, and what they said instead is eat more of us, right? Eat more because now we're fortified. Now we're part of a balanced breakfast. Again, that's where that phraseology comes from. And you can see as the cereal history, as commercials got more and more aggressively pointed at kids, and especially as it relates to the 70s, 80s, and 90s, we'll talk about that in a minute, at least in the 1940s. So if you look in the early 1940s, if you can blow up right here, it says Post's Sugar Crisp, right? So for snacks, it's so handy. And then down here, what you can't see in this is, or it's like candy. So at least in this advertisement, they were honest. They were saying it's like candy, so they were being honest with it. Today, so many parents are buying these sugary cereals for their children, and they're calling it part of a balanced breakfast, or in their mind, they're thinking that it's part of a balanced breakfast. They're not thinking it's candy, but in reality is, if you're eating these types of cereals, basically you're eating candy for breakfast. And, candy's not breakfast food. Shouldn't be, right? So, again, 1945, following World War II, we got cereal companies now starting to target ads toward children. And these were the three sugar bears for the sugar, what ultimately became Sugar Smacks. And the three bears became one, if you remember that particular bear when you were growing up. And then, so fast forward from the 40s into the 50s. Now we have, The same doctor I mentioned earlier, Dr. Willem Dickey, he publishes an article based on his doctoral thesis linking wheat proteins, particularly linking gluten, damage to the mucosal lining of the intestine. And what happened was very interesting because he was during World War II. He was treating kids in the hospitals, and what happened was grain rationing. So grain was rationed, and he noticed a trend in the kids with celiac disease that they would get better. So they would improve. Patients would improve without grain. And so he's observing this entire decade of research, and he publishes his thesis in 1953, and that becomes scientific knowledge and history. Now, let's come to this point. So now we have established that the reason that celiac disease happens is as a result of grain. We've established as well that regional ileitis or Crohn's disease, we've also established other inflammatory bowel diseases are contributed to by grain. We've established that beriberi and pellagra, nutritional deficiency diseases, are killing thousands of people a year as a result of the malnourishing, the malnourishing effect of eating processed cereals. And now I want to give you a little kind of historical perspective on the quantitative production of grain. So we're moving past the 1950s. You can see in this chart, we start in 1960 and we're moving through 2020. And we can see here, and this is millions of metric tons of grain produced. And so you can see up here in the top, you've got corn. And so you can see what happens with corn is from 1961 to 2019-20, the millions of metric tons of corn production have increased 5.5 times, from 205 million metric tons to 1,148. So we see something similar with rice, from 285 to 755, as well with wheat. You see almost 3.5 times greater, from 222 to 768. Barley doubles from 72 to 159. Sorghum increases. Millet increases a little bit. Oats actually surprisingly are cut down. Triticale goes up. Rye goes down just a little bit, but the vast majority go up, right? So you got predominantly rice and corn and wheat and barley as being some of the biggest, most commonly produced. So we're now producing massive quantities. And how can we do this? How can we go and take this production to such great heights? This is where, you know, in comes GMO. We got new pesticides. We're developing technology that allows farmers to not have to work as hard, these big combines and other big machines that allow for large swaths of planting. And so we're able to ramp up production with these different technologies coming onto the scene. And so that brings us to the point of, you know, if we look at since 1974, what have we seen happen? So a lot of people say, well, why wasn't celiac disease around? Why wasn't gluten sensitivity around, you know, years ago when I was growing up? And it was around. It's just that we have so much more production of grain. Remember what I said earlier is that 50% of total calories comes from wheat in the U.S. And so when we see an increase quantitatively in how much people are eating, and we see these cereal companies just basically pawning cereal off on our children as if it's the bee's knees, we get massive increase in total caloric intake coming from grain. And you can see here, just in the U.S., statistically speaking, an increase of celiac disease since 1974 to today, a 5-fold increase. So we've increased it in part because we've increased this, right? And if you think of gluten, it's not like this all or none thing. It's not like the more you eat, if you're gluten sensitive, the more you poison yourself. The less you eat, the less you poison yourself. And so when you increase it as a staple food in a diet of a culture, you're going to see an epidemic shift toward a trend in disease development. And what we know about gluten particularly, and gluten is not just in wheat, but it's in other grains as well, is we know that it is the #1 cause of autoimmune disease. It's the #1 most well-researched and well-studied trigger for autoimmune disease. And most people understand that as it relates to celiac disease. But unfortunately, very few, and this is true even in the medical field, very few doctors are aware of the overwhelming amount of research on the implication of gluten consumption and the induction of other autoimmune diseases. There's a connection with type 1 diabetes, there's a connection with autoimmune hepatitis and polyendocrine problems and infertility issues and pericarditis and myocarditis and ankylosing spondylitis and rheumatoid arthritis and psoriatic arthritis and eczema and psoriasis and autoimmune diseases of the brain like bipolar and schizophrenia. And so we have this long list of autoimmune diseases that we know gluten can help trigger. Gluten's not the only trigger for autoimmune disease, so let's be careful not to just place blame only on gluten for this, but we definitely have to look at it. So again, this is a trend that's happening. Remember, we look at, because again, a lot of you ask me the question, this is since 1974, so we got a 5-fold increased risk. When did glyphosate become heavily used on grain? It was in the early 1990s. So we were seeing this 5-fold increased risk, okay, before glyphosate was being used on crops. So I want to emphasize that because a lot of you think, hey, I'm just going to go to Europe and I'm going to eat all the grain I want. I get this question so frequently that I wanted to make sure I was addressing it. And then we have this too. This is a recent meta-analysis on incidence of celiac disease. You can see here is increasing over time. And this is not just U.S. data, but what we're looking at is a kind of a data set from 1950 to the year 2020. And so if you go back again to the timeline, we didn't even know what caused celiac disease. We didn't even know how to diagnose it or what caused it until 1953, right? So this is why we're starting here with what looks like low numbers. And probably if we went back to the year 1900, we would have some kind of a plot graph where we could show it, but we just didn't have enough grain in the human diet to see mass quantities. And it wasn't until, again, those early 1900s where cereal was becoming more and more common and more available in households. And it really wasn't until the 1940s when this took off. And so if you think of it from that perspective and then you look at this graph and this plot, you can see tremendous increase. And it's not just in the US. So a lot of you say, well, I can go to Europe and I can eat the pasta or cereal and I don't feel as bad. I'm not saying you're wrong and I'm not saying your experience is incorrect. I'm just saying if you're gluten sensitive, that's a very dangerous statement to make because gluten can still damage you. And we look at Italy, for example, in the purple, and you can see their incidence rates have gone way up too. You look at Italy, Italy's much higher moving through history, and they're not using glyphosate. So again, this isn't just a story of glyphosate. A lot of you want to blame that pesticide as the reason for all of the increase in all of these different chronic diseases and conditions. And I don't think that we can do that because you can see many of these European countries, including New Zealand, their incidence of celiac disease is skyrocketing since 1950. And glyphosate isn't the only thing that can explain that. So very, very important that you understand that, especially if you want to keep your health. Let's talk about autoimmune disease as a whole. I mentioned earlier that gluten was the #1 most well-studied cause or trigger for autoimmune disease, and we can see in this diagram published from New England Journal in 2002, and it's not all forms of autoimmune disease, but you can see multiple sclerosis, Crohn's, type 1 diabetes, and asthma are the 4 forms of autoimmune disease that are being listed in this diagram, and you can see big increases in all of these. And so again, where did glyphosate come into the scene? Right here. But when did we start seeing increases? Way back here, right? So this is not a glyphosate issue. This is, in my opinion, this is definitely a in part a gluten issue, but also in part an increased or ramped up production of grains. There's also hybridization of grains and manipulation of grains in other ways. The use of nitrogen and monocropping are all, I think, contributing to this. But the other aspect to this is the other kind of 10,000-pound elephant in the room is processed chemicals. So beyond pesticides, what are our children being exposed to en masse? They're being exposed to, and not just our children, all of us as well, but there are 30,000 chemicals in use today that haven't been adequately studied. 3,000 of them are approved in our food. Multiple of them are approved in what we put on our food. And so these chemicals are part of the equation. What else is part of this equation? The chemicals that children are being injected with. So, you know, you've got, if you understand the history, and we won't get into the history of vaccination tonight, but, you know, if we go back, it was around 1943 that we started introducing this right here. And then when we got to somewhere in the 1986, I believe it was, we took away liability from these guys. We took away manufacturing liability so that they could no longer be sued. And so then the vaccine schedule went way up and increased dramatically. So we have this huge increase in the number of these given to babies. I think it went from, like, don't quote me on this, 6 or 7 by the age of 2 to somewhere around 24 shots before the age of 2, again with that loss of liability, the schedule changed, and so we were pumping babies full of so many different chemicals and a lot of these vaccines, and we could argue, debate the merits of vaccines if you'd like, but the biggest issue here isn't the merit of whether they work, it's the actual adjuvants. The adjuvants in them are different chemicals, again, that we're pumping directly in through this, past the skin, into the child. And so we're getting a bulk of exposures to different chemicals, and we're bypassing the innate immune system of tiny babies that can't talk, they can't speak for themselves, they can't tell you how they feel. All they can do is cry or die, possibly. And so again, these are all other factors on this timeline. You've got chemical exposures, you've got an increase in these here, and so we see this trend, and we see the same trend not just with these forms of autoimmune disease, but we see this with Hashimoto's disease. We see this with the rheumatological diseases like lupus. So this trend, very, very much as a timeline perspective, we can correlate increased grain consumption, but, you know, to the increased rise in autoimmune disease. We can correlate increased antibiotic use. That's the other thing that I would point out, is antibiotic use also became more widespread in the 1940s and on and forward. And there are many very intelligent scientists that believe the antibiotic combined with hyper-hygiene, overwashing of hands, overutilization of chemicals in the name of hygiene, led to basically a rise in autoimmune disease, and they refer to this as the hygiene hypothesis, which is we're too clean and we're not being exposed to enough germs, and because of that, our immune systems aren't getting proper training, and what they're being trained against are things that are very, very foreign. So our immune systems are appropriately behaving in a manner that's consistent with creating inflammation and driving forward the process of chronic inflammatory autoimmune diseases. And so again, we can correlate that with grain consumption. We can correlate that with hyper use of antibiotics. We can correlate that with more chemicals and more vaccines. So again, I don't want to only just look at cereal and blame cereal for everything as an end-all be-all cause, but I think it's important that you understand the history, because again, if we kind of summarize, we didn't even have cereal before 1895. It didn't really exist to any great amount in any household, and it really wasn't until, you know, the 1930s, 1940s, where we saw processed cereal foods becoming major staples, and where we saw the cereal manufacturers and companies really target women and children in their ads, because women were the primary caretakers of the home. They're the ones that went to the grocery store and bought the products. The kids were the ones that really were targeted the most with cartoon characters in a very manipulative way. And so here we are today, where the average person in the U.S. and in other industrialized countries today believes that cereal is a necessity, that grain is a necessity in the human diet. And the fact of the matter is it's not. In prior 1900, grain was part of the human diet in the U.S., but it was a much smaller part. And so this is one of the reasons why we don't see earlier on in the history of our country the rapid quantity or growth of autoimmune disease, because this was not being used as a staple food. Grains were not being used as a staple food. So there you have it. Thanks for joining me for the Dr. Osborne Zone. And make sure you pump your questions into the feed tonight so that I can answer them for you at Thursday, 12:30 Central Standard Time. And you can join me then as well. I'll be answering questions live. Thanks and take care. Hey, today we've got a couple of different cereals or kind of cereals. We've got here on the right, we've got something by a company called Paleo Nola, which is like a granola type mix that you could use as a cereal. I've actually done it before, so I'm cheating here. I've already eaten this one. And then over here we have another supposed gluten-free cereal that we're going to be reviewing as well. So the Paleo Nola brand, so this one is a grain-free, so big points for that. So is it gluten-free? It absolutely is. There's absolutely no grain in it. So we'll give it a green check mark on the gluten-free front. As far as its taste is concerned, if you've never had, or if you've ever had granola and you're kind of missing that crunchy, kind of oaty taste, let's give it a go. Yeah, so that's pretty good, especially if you like nuts. I mean, there's a number of different nuts in this one. I'll read you the ingredients in a minute, but it's got a slightly sweet taste, little kind of like a kiss of honey almost, but it's not so overpoweringly sweet, which is something I really don't like. So if you like really sweet, this may not be the granola for you, but if you like sweet or don't like sweet, just a hint, this is solid. Ingredient-wise, let's read this off. It's got almonds, pecans, pepitas, and honey, walnuts, coconut, sunflower seeds, flax seeds, and then some dried cranberries that are sweetened with apple juice concentrate, and then dried coconut, vanilla extract, and cinnamon. So that's pretty solid, pretty clean list of ingredients. And although not every ingredient in this product is organic, many of them are, and so I give it points for that. It would be a better product. So if you guys that make this stuff are listening, it'd be a better product if you put 100% organic into it. So, good quality overall. From a price perspective, this small bag, which there's a lot of calories in this, so you wouldn't want to go overboard on it, but it's about $9.50 a bag. You could probably find it on sale or use a coupon if you could find one of those as well. And then per serving, there's 10 servings in this bag, and each serving is 170 calories. So there's a ton of calories in this. This shouldn't be something you polish off in an afternoon, unless you're just looking to gain a ton of weight. But overall, solid, something I would use, something I have used. I actually travel sometimes with this if I know I'm going to be out and about where it might be hard to get some real food. So this one gets a thumbs up, definitely a thumbs up. So let's move over to this next one. This is Catalina Crunch. You can see already from the front, it looks kind of like, if you remember in the old days, if you grew up when I did, this looks like Golden Grahams, kind of the same type of shape. So cereal. And then I'm going to go to the ingredients on this because I can't eat it. So let me just share the ingredients with you first. So the first thing is it's got Catalina flour, which is a pea protein and potato fiber mixed with corn fiber, chicory fiber, and guar gum. So that's the number one ingredient, is a mixture of those different things. So already out of the bat, right? So if you've looked at this and you know it says gluten-free on it, but it's got corn in it. So this is, again, not something that I would recommend if you're trying to stay on a gluten-free diet. And the next ingredient is tapioca flour, high oleic sunflower oil, baking powder, natural flavors. Who knows what that means? Oftentimes, by the way, natural flavors, it doesn't always have to be bad, but sometimes natural flavors are corn derivative, and so that's something that you want to look out for. And then beyond that, stevia. So Not something I'll eat, so not something I can really give you a taste review on because I don't want to poison myself because there's gluten in it. So can't give you a great rating. I'm actually not impressed. I was told about this product from some of you who obviously you weren't listening very well because one of the main ingredients in this product is corn. So, this one definitely gets a thumb down. Gluten and lactose in drugs pose a serious health risk. And this is according to a new study published in the Journal of Science and Translational Medicine. And so what they found in this study analyzed 42,000 prescription and over-the-counter medications. And so here are some of the bits from this research study. An average pill contains 8 inactive ingredients, and some contain as many as 20 or more. Now, when you take into the fact that 39% of seniors take at least 5 prescription medications, that's a lot of room for a lot of inactive fillers that could create or pose potential risks or threats. The report also found that 45% of the analyzed medications contain lactose, which is the sugar found in dairy. A third of the medications contained a food dye associated with allergic reactions, and more than half of these medicines contained at least one type of sugar. What's with the sugar in the drugs? I mean, can't we do better? Why are we putting something that we know contributes to chronic degenerative disease and inflammation inside of the very medicines that are purported to be of benefit for people's health? Now, another recent study found that 18% of manufacturers polled claim that their medications contain gluten. So that's 18% of all medications potentially containing gluten. Now, how many of you are taking medicine and you're also gluten sensitive? That's an alarming statistic. Now, how do we solve for this? Well, one of the ways we solve for this is we look at the ingredient list on any drug we're prescribed. So, this also includes over-the-counter medication. Let's put on the screen here. This is a label for over-the-counter medications, and you'll see highlighted there, you'll see a section called inactive ingredients. That's what you want to look at. The other section on the label lists active ingredients, which is actually just the name of the drug. But you want to look at the inactive ingredient section because this is where all the innocuous terms that could be gluten-based or other allergy-based items that you really want to look at before you decide you're going to take a medication. So you can see in this particular example, one of the ingredients is dextrose. Now, dextrose is sugar, right, and commonly derived from corn. You can also see further down the list, you'll see the term starch. And starch means a lot of things. Starch could mean wheat starch, potato starch, tapioca, or corn starch. Again, it's an innocuous term, and if you're not sure, it's best to call the manufacturer to get clarity on what type of starch is being used in that medication, especially if you're allergic or sensitive to gluten. Now, on the other side of the equation, which is the non-over-the-counter medications, if you have a prescription drug, they're typically, when you go fill that prescription at the pharmacy, they will staple a little sheet to the bag, and that little sheet unfolds, and it's got tiny, tiny print, and this is all the information about that drug. You're supposed to get that sheet when you pick up your drug. Now, make sure you open that sheet up because you'll find, although it may be in microscopic print, you will find an active ingredient list for the medication. And so it's always important to cross-reference that list with anything that you might be reactive to. In essence, we don't want you to get glutened accidentally by the very medication your doctor's trying to give you to treat, any of your conditions. Now, below this video, what I'm going to do is I'm going to put up a couple of things for you. Number one, I'm going to put up a link to hidden terms. Like, these are the terms that gluten hides under. And so if you're not sure, it won't always just say gluten super obviously. There are a lot of synonyms. Check this list out. Use it as a resource guide to help you navigate this complex issue. I'm also going to put up a research study that was published. Now, this study's a little bit older, but it was the top 200 medications prescribed in the U.S. And so what happened in this study is they called all these manufacturers of 200 different drugs to ask them whether or not gluten was in their product. And this study contains that diagram of all those medications. Now, I will warn you, this study is from 2013, and ingredients change. Sometimes manufacturers change what they put in their product. So don't use this list as the end-all be-all for how you make that decision, but use it as a guide. And so the biggest thing that you can do and the smartest thing that you can do is have a conversation with your doctor. If you're gluten sensitive, if you're allergic to certain things, you want to make sure you have a conversation with your doctor, because the solution, if your medication contains gluten or other allergens, is to ask that doctor to write you a prescription for the same medication, but have that prescription filled in a compounding pharmacy where they can take the active ingredient of the drug and blend it with things you're not allergic to, so that you're not being harmed by the very medication that your doctor intended to treat you with. Newsflash. Sugar is not a breakfast food, but that's what the cereal industry would have you believe. As a matter of fact, check out this map on the board. This is a revenue map of cereal products sold globally, and you can see here that $20 billion, $20.59 billion is made annually by the cereal industry in the U.S. alone. The global market is up to close to $50 billion. So this is not small money. This is not chump change we're talking about. And that's one of the reasons why your children have been targeted for sales of cereal and consumption of cereal. Think about it, all the cartoon characters. Let's look at this next thing. This is a study published in the journal Appetite. And you can see here, breakfast cereals represent the most highly advertised packaged food on child-targeted television, and most ads are for cereals high in sugar. In fully adjusted analysis, the number of sugar breakfast cereal brands children consumed was positively associated with their exposure to targeted ads. Children consumed 14% more cereal brands for every 10 ads they were shown over a 7-day period of time. Exposure to child-targeted sugar-based cereal TV advertising is positively associated with brand consumption among preschool-aged children. These findings support recommendations to limit the marketing of high-sugar foods to young children. Remember this cartoon character? He was banned from tobacco using him as a result of ads potentially being targeted for younger folks. Why aren't we doing the same thing with cereal? Again, sugar is not breakfast, and we shouldn't really pin it or position it in such a way. And look, parents, part of this is in your court too. You can't just blame cereal companies for advertising to your kids. I mean, the ball falls in your court to take responsibility over what you're allowing your children to eat for breakfast. As we all have argued over many, many years, isn't breakfast the most important meal of the day? I would argue in today's world, breakfast has become the poison of the day. Now, back to advertisers. Check out this image. What you're looking at here is, was published by Cornell, and so this is how sneaky and creepy the cereal companies are. This is how manipulative and how tricky they are at trying to target your kids. If you check out this image, according to this study on cereals, if you position the cartoon characters on children's cereal boxes to have an eye angulation of 9.6 degrees down, it increases the child's trust of that brand by 16%. Now that's, honestly, that's eerie. That's creepy as you can get. The fact that they're studying it to that level so that they know where to position the cartoon characters to manipulate the minds of your children to want to buy and trust that brand more should tell you something about the nature of who these people are. In my opinion, not so good. So again, sugar is not for breakfast.
All right, Doc, today's question is, what was your favorite subject in high school?
Man, my favorite subject arguably was geology, the study of the earth. Really liked rocks, still do, collect rocks and crystals. I really had a great teacher who fostered me, and I think that was where a big part of my interest came from, because it was such a fascinating topic. And interestingly enough, as I was in undergrad, my major actually was geology. I was studying geology because I wanted to become a volcanologist, a doctor who climbs around the rims of volcanoes. And my big plan was to become a volcanologist and move to Hawaii and study volcanoes. And then I had children, and I realized that climbing around the lip of a volcano might not be the greatest degree of job security. So I ended up shifting majors, and lucky for me, and I think maybe lucky for many of you, that I found my way to nutrition and found my way to health and wellness, because here I am today, 21 years later, and hopefully providing you some value and some value to the world to help change lives. Thanks for tuning in to the Dr. Osborne Zone. Don't forget to share, like, and subscribe for more content like this, and make sure you come back next Tuesday at 6 p.m. Central Standard Time and Thursday at noon 30 for more episodes.